Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to ACF Financial Monitoring Environment for the single audit and the recipient monitoring compliance. We're excited to have you all join us for this session today during the ACF Indigenous Program Conference. But before we begin, we will be sharing some instructions on how to interact during this session. At this time, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Paul.
Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Paul Humfer. I'm a grants management specialist in ACF, and I will be your ACF room monitor for this workshop. I have no detention slips. You're all set to go. I'm so appreciative you guys are here today. Thank you for attending. I do need to share some quick housekeeping items before I turn it over to our presenters today. If you have questions during the presentation, please submit them through the chat box. I'll be tracking that closely throughout the session. I'll monitor and record these for the Q&A session later on within this hour. If you have questions during the Q&A session, then please just raise your hand if you want us to address it and we'll call on you. Or you can once again submit your question in the chat box if you'd like. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible, and hopefully you have lots of them, and we are in that situation not to answer all of them. Please note, I will provide a survey link for this workshop in the chat box. I'll do this here in a second. We would appreciate capturing your feedback for this workshop session on this session, which you can do by taking the survey after this workshop. I'll provide the link again at the end of the session, and the survey link can also be found on the live agenda on the ACF IPC website, along with the session's presentation handout for download. Finally, as a quick reminder, all workshop sessions are being recorded for on-demand viewing via the 2022 ACF IPC website until April 25th, 2022. Please visit the live agenda page if you'd like to view these recordings after the conference. I will now turn it over to our ACF workshop facilitator, Patty Roberts, again to begin.
Okay, thank you for those opening messages, Paul. Now let's get started with the workshop. Hey, I'm Patty Roberts. I'm a grant management specialist with Region 10 out of the Seattle area, and I've been with ACF for about 5.5 years. Next slide, please.
Surveillance system, public health surveillance system for the country.
Everybody, please mute your mics if they're not already.
Of the state. So, like.
Thank you. Okay, during this session, we're going to emphasize on the overview of federal financial regulations, ACF financial monitoring environment, the single audit overview, and ACF recipient compliance monitoring process. And your presenters for this workshop today will be Wes Hogan. He's a risk oversight manager from the Office of Administration. He has been with ACF for 6 years, and he has a wealth of knowledge in various areas. Today, he will be presenting on the federal financial regulations and the recipient compliance monitoring. Then we have Kristania Knutson, who comes to us from Region 2 as an audit resolution manager. She's been with ACF for over 6 years. She has an extensive knowledge in audits. So what better person to cover the overview of the single audits than her? She will also give you some common audit errors. And last but not least, our room monitor, Paul Humfer, a grant management specialist from Region 5. He's been with ACF for over 7 years. He will be utilizing his experience and knowledge as the room monitor by reviewing and answering questions in the chat and also assist the other two presenters. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Wes, the first presenter. Wes, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Patty. So we wanted to do a little table setting first with everyone on here, make sure we're all kind of starting from the same general place before we get into too many details, and just give you guys a very brief overview of the regulations that are governing most of what we're talking about today. So just from the start, these are ACF Financial Assistance Awards. That is the official terminology for grants and or cooperative agreements issued by ACF. These are governed by a combination of program-specific statutes and regulations and administrative regulations that typically apply across a broad spectrum of ACF programs. ACF follows Title 45 of the Code of Federal Regulations, also known as the Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for HHS Awards. That is Part 75 of Title 45. That is HHS's implementation of 2 CFR 200. That is the overarching federal guidelines for uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for HHS awards. Differences between the two are, for the most part, they are one and the same. There are some differences between the two in very specific areas. We won't be covering a lot of details about that today, but just wanted to note, by and large, they are mainly the same regulations. Compliance with Part 45 CFR Part 75 is required by most ACF discretionary, actually all ACF discretionary and most ACF mandatory programs. There are some exceptions for several mandatory programs, either whole exceptions to Part 75 or certain parts of it. But one thing that there is no exception to for anybody is Subpart F, which is the audit requirement section, dealing with single audits for ACF recipients. And then also just to give you guys awareness of the ACF financial monitoring environment. This is centered around, we basically have two sides of financial of a monitoring environment at ACF for our financial assistance awards, financial side and the programmatic side. We do work in tandem with the program office counterparts, very, very much so in many areas. But in some instances, financial and programmatic are done together. There may be, some mix of the two, but we are mainly talking about financial and things related to financial monitoring today. So just to give you a sense of the overall environment. So starting at the top, just going around the circle, review of financial and property reports. Every program that we have has a financial reporting requirement. The specific form that you may use and the frequency with which you're required to submit that form may be different, but everybody has some financial reporting requirement. Program monitoring reviews. Now we talked about OGM, Office of Grants Management, which mainly handles financial oversight, versus program offices, which mainly handle programmatic oversight. But we do have instances where program run reviews may include financial components. So that is, we definitely want to acknowledge that as a key piece of this overall financial monitoring environment, excuse me. Special conditions, those are things where we may be, or within the CFR, we are allowed to add certain specific elements to specific awards if there is a condition that warrants it. Those are fairly unique situations, so that's not something we use broadly, but just something that we use as another monitoring tool. Audit resolution and compliance. Kristania is going to be talking very heavily about this very shortly. Within audit resolution, that is resolving audit findings for audits that have already been issued. The compliance supplement is kind of the upfront. This is what auditors use to direct their audit work in the first place. Program and recipient level risk assessment. So this is mainly, you don't get a lot of visibility into this. We do several mandated risk assessments at the programmatic level, and then we also do some things at the actual recipient level internally. That helps us kind of focus where we direct our monitoring work, where we think there may be issues, where we have to report up that based on assessment of risk, we think there may be issues. There's several activities that we do internally there. And then financial monitoring reviews, policy, cost, et cetera. I'm going to be talking about that in the latter half of the presentation a little bit more thoroughly. This is specific things that ACF has been doing or is planning to do for some of your organizations related to financial monitoring that we've started within the past few years. So I'll get more into that later. So now I'm going to turn it over to Paul, who is going to handle our first poll question.
Thanks, Wes. Joe, could you put up our first poll question, please? Thank you, everyone. So we're going to take a little bit of time here. If you could, it should be interactive. You should be able to select your question or answer your question. What do you consider the difference between an audit and a monitoring review? Good. People are still answering. We're up to 55, 58. Great. Thank you. I think that's it. Got the last couple more here. All right. Can you see the results? Can we end the poll and post the results? Oh, I have to do that. Sorry. All right, so at first place is monitoring as a check the box exercise. Looks like we got a tie between there is none and I have no idea. Thank you for your honesty. And audits are bad / worse. Okay, Wes, I'll let you take it from there.
All right, we're gonna turn it over to Christania now. The half of you that picked monitoring as a check the box exercise, I'm gonna prove you wrong in a little bit, but first Christania is going to go over some things about audit for us. So Christania, take it away.
All right. Hello there, everyone. I'm just glad that audits are bad worse came up last place. That means they're not as bad as I thought people would say. So that's good news for me. Hi, everyone. I'm Christania Knudsen. I'm ACF's Audit Resolution Manager. My team oversees the audit resolution process for ACF grantees that have audit findings. So we go ahead and then we review the audit reports and respond to those findings via a management decision letter. Now, today we're just going to give an overview of the single audit process, which is one of the federal government's major controls to provide assurance as far as the compliance with federal award requirements. Federal agencies use audits as an aid in determining whether resources have been safeguarded, federal funds have been expended properly, and whether the desired program results have been achieved. As Wes had also mentioned earlier, federal agencies may utilize the single audit to assess risk when reviewing an application for funding. They may review whether or not your audit reports have been submitted timely. They might review what kind of audit opinion the auditor gave on your financial statements and what types of findings are you getting. Do you have question costs in that report? Are there any material weaknesses that have been identified? So these are some of the main topics that a federal agency would look at when we're looking at an audit report. Next slide, please. So what triggers a single audit? Non-federal entities expending $750,000 or more in federal awards cumulatively in a fiscal year must have a single or program-specific audit conducted. Now, when I say $750,000 or more, that is for all federal expenditures, for all federal awards. That's not per federal program. So you need to look at it as a whole for all awards. So if you're off by $1 and you get an award for $1, you're over that threshold. Now, the single audit is used to ensure that grant funds are properly accounted for and used for their intended purposes. And single audits must be submitted by the grantees to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse no later than 9 months after the end of the audit period. Next slide, please. Okay, so what does a single audit entail? It encompasses an examination of the recipient's financial records, financial statements, your federal award transactions, which would include drawdowns from payment management and being traced to the actual expenditures that you paid those drawdowns with, the general management operations, what type of internal control systems you have in place, and also any federal assistance that's received during the audit period, which is usually a given fiscal year. Next slide, please. So what are the auditee responsibilities for a single audit? I know many of you On the call are auditees or your recipients of federal grant funds. So the auditee is responsible to procure or otherwise arrange for the audit as required. So you need to get an auditor, basically an independent auditor. A lot of times you'll look out and send out requests for proposals to pick that auditor. Then you're going to need to, the recipient needs to prepare the appropriate financial statements. I think this is something a lot of people kind of have a misconception on. They think the auditor prepares the financial statements. Well, actually, the auditor audits the financial statements. The recipients need to prepare that. And also the recipients need to include the schedule of expenditure of federal awards, or sometimes we refer to it as the SAFA. That's a supplemental schedule to the financial statements that's required for single audits. And we mentioned before that the single audit is triggered when federal expenditures reported on the SAFA exceed $750,000 or more. So a mistake on the SAFA could actually cause an organization to conduct a single audit when it's not actually required. For example, if you were to list the total amounts that you're awarded instead of what you actually spend, you might incorrectly trigger the requirement to get audited. So we don't want to do that. So an auditee also needs to provide the auditor with access to personnel records, any accounts, books, supporting documentation, maybe invoices or checks to support some of those general ledger entries, and other information needed for the auditor to perform the audit as required by the uniform guidance. The auditee needs to promptly follow up and take corrective action on any audit findings that are identified. Sometimes the auditor will still be there and not even have issued the report yet, and we've seen grantees where they go ahead and correct that while the auditor is there. The auditor can then document this was corrected before we even issued the report. But it's best, that doesn't always occur, but it's best that we try to implement those corrective actions as soon as possible and possibly prevent the reoccurrence from that finding in the next audit. The recipient is also required to prepare a summary schedule of prior audit findings and corrective action plan. You need to basically summarize what has happened with your prior audit findings and then identify, have they been corrected? Were the corrective actions fully implemented? If not, if those findings are repeated in the future audits, you want to see some sort of progress with that corrective action plan. Has something else been done that didn't address that finding in the past? Because if we just keep seeing the same audit finding year to year and the corrective action plan is identical, well, obviously something isn't working there and that finding keeps occurring again. So we at least want to see some sort of progress with that corrective action plan if it does happen again year to year. Next slide, please. So what are the auditor responsibilities for a single audit? The auditor is required to conduct the audit in accordance with generally accepted government accounting standards. This is also known as the Yellow Book, which is put out by the U.S. Government Accountability Office. The auditor needs to determine whether the financial statements that the auditee prepared are presented fairly and are in accordance with GAAP, which is generally accepted accounting principles. Now, GAAP, oftentimes the auditor, when they're looking along the lines of GAAP, they're looking for consistency. Are the same standards applied throughout the financial reporting process? Can we assume that this business entity will continue to operate, or is there a going concern that it'll cease operations? What is the dollar threshold for materiality for the entity? Some entities, maybe a few $1,000s is not considered much. For others, it could be considered significant. You wouldn't need to disclose perhaps a parking ticket for a dollar threshold to materiality, but you might need to disclose a lawsuit as a contingent liability. Now, the auditor also needs to determine whether the schedule of expenditure of federal awards is stated fairly, as we discussed before. Also, the auditor needs to obtain an understanding and test internal controls. So the auditor might want to review to see if there's adequate controls for the safeguarding of federal assets. Is there adequate segregation of duties in the procurement and disbursement processes? Are there procedures where perhaps more than one approval or signature is required for purchases that exceed a dollar threshold? Again, tying back to GAAP and the materiality concept. And then auditors will also look to see if there's internal controls specifically towards the major program compliance. For example, does the management review and approve financial status reports? Sometimes we have entities that have a board of directors, and often they're responsible. Now we want to see, is that board of directors reviewing the financial status reports? Also an internal control. Do you have on file, as far as supporting documentation, if they're tied to eligibility requirements? Do you maintain that eligibility information on file? So again, these are some of the items the auditor may look for when they're testing the internal controls. The auditor also wants to determine compliance with federal award and program requirements, looking to see if there's been any violation of the contracts or grant agreements that could have a material effect on the financial statements. Is the grantee using indirect cost rates accurately? Have there been material non-compliance with requirements applicable to the federal programs, and were the program funds used for their intended purposes? So these are all items that an auditor is responsible for testing when they review the financial statements in the program. Now, the auditor is going to then, after reviewing everything, prepare a schedule of findings and question costs and follow up on prior audit findings if there were any in the year before, and provide an opinion of the audit. And now there's 4 types of opinion. There's the unqualified, qualified, disclaimer, and adverse. Now, the unqualified is basically the clean bill of health. Everything looks okay. And then as you get to adverse, well, that's where, okay, something's really wrong here, and the auditor can't give an opinion. And it could even possibly mean that the financial statements are misstated, there's significant non-compliance, and perhaps even fraud. Next slide, please. So the compliance supplement, this is what the auditors use as a guide. It's actually required to be used. If there is a program identified specifically in the compliance supplement, the auditor must use this document. It's issued by the Office of Management and Budget to assist auditors in performing audits, and it's updated annually. It identifies important compliance requirements for many federal programs, including the program objectives, procedures, and the compliance requirements that are most likely to cause improper payments or fraud, waste, and abuse, and generate audit findings. The program offices will submit updates to the compliance supplement annually if there's any changes in the program. So when you read this document, it's not just compiled by the Office of Management and Budget, it's actually compiled individually by each program office. So if you see, for example, ACF has the child care funds. That child care program office will work on that section of the compliance supplement and update it if there's been any changes in that as of that year. Without the supplement, auditors would have to research the laws and regulations for each program on their own. And so providing this supplement is really more efficient and cost effective, because I'm sure you could imagine too, if you had to procure and pay for the auditor's time and they had to go about and spend that time reviewing the laws and getting updated to that, well, that would be quite time consuming and costly. So now, as I said, many federal programs are identified specifically in the supplement, and there's specific audit guides for programs, but then there are some programs that might be smaller that are not specifically identified in the supplement. So the compliance supplement part 7 provides guidance for auditing programs that are not included within the compliance supplement. So it's a generalized audit guide. Next slide, please. So this here is an example. This is the compliance supplement audit matrix. Now, the audit matrix it's specific areas for auditors to focus on when conducting its audit of federal programs. So here there's 12 areas of compliance within the audit matrix. And you can see its activities, allowed or unallowed, allowable costs and cost principles, cash management, eligibility, equipment and real property management. That might be where an auditor tests to see if that you're tracking your inventory. Matching, that might check for non-federal funds, or if there's a matching requirement for a federal grant. Level of effort, earmarking, say if there is an administrative cost cap that is tied to a specific program, an auditor may test for that. Period of performance, that would be when you need to account for that funds have been expended for the period of performance of the federal award. Procurement and suspension and debarment, are there adequate procurement policies in place for say, purchasing something that's above the micro purchase threshold or the simplified acquisition threshold? And then, of course, we cannot be working with contractors that may have been suspended or debarred from doing work with federal government contracts. Program income, reporting, are you submitting your federal reports on time? Subrecipient monitoring for those that have pass-through entities or have pass-through funds. So do they then go ahead and test and review their subrecipients? And then, of course, there's the special tests and provisions where the program offices develop certain tests for very specific items within the compliance supplement. It's sort of a mini audit within the audit, where they may test a certain component of that audit of the program. So here we're looking at, on the screen, you may have noticed that some of these out of the 12, you have some marked yes and some marked no. Now this is an excerpt from the 2021 supplement for the LIHEAP assistance program. So basically, as of 2019, the OMB, they decided that instead of having auditors focus on all 12 of these compliance requirements, they were going to narrow it down to 6 and have the program offices specifically decide what areas they think the auditors should be focusing on. So for here, these are the areas that the Office of Community Services determined were really the places they needed auditors to focus on when monitoring the LIHEAP program. But that doesn't mean that the auditors won't look at the other areas, because there are instances where if they think, based on gap or expanding their scope, they need to look further. They may look into some of those other areas, but their primary focus is going to be on those items marked yes within the audit matrix in the compliance supplement. Next slide, please. So within the auditor responsibilities, they must now review those areas of compliance and identify whether there's significant deficiencies and material weaknesses in the internal controls, whether there's any material non-compliance with the provisions of the federal statute, regulations, or terms and conditions of the federal awards, whether there's known question costs that are greater than $25,000 or known question costs that are when likely the costs are greater than $25,000, and of course, whether there's any known or likely fraud. Next slide, please. So then, of course, it comes to my team and what the federal agency's responsibilities are for a single audit. And I mentioned before, I'm the audit resolution manager. So we have a team, we receive the single audits, we review them and see what audit findings have been identified. And now we must go ahead and issue a management decision in response to those audit findings. We work with the program offices specifically to see, what they weigh in on, and we state whether or not the audit finding is sustained and the reason for that decision. Sometimes we might request additional information or documentation from either the recipient or even sometimes the auditor if we're not entirely clear what the finding is, or we may request the auditor's work papers. In that management decision letter, we're going to state whether there's any expected action to repay disallowed costs or make any financial adjustments, or if there's any other corrective actions that we think should be added. Usually the grantees or recipients, they've already included their corrective action plan. But when we issue our decision, we might say, well, okay, you've stated you're going to do this, but maybe you should also take some additional steps. You know, maybe there's a cause, and maybe you should identify that and put this into your policies and procedures and formalize that process. Our management decision letter is also going to describe any appeal process that might be available. So of course, if you don't agree that there should have been a disallowance for question costs, you can challenge that in the appeal process. And then of course, we are required to issue that management decision letter within 6 months of the acceptance of the audit by the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. Next slide, please. So now we're just going to talk about some of the common audit findings that we're seeing within the unit. Now, of course, I think one of the most common is going to be allowable costs and cost principles. So, you know, obviously, we want to see that costs that we're spending federal funds on, that's necessary, reasonable, and allocable to that federal award. Oftentimes, we see findings associated that the entity hasn't received prior approval. Some of these requirements, equipment purchases that exceed $5,000, you need to get prior approval, and you should get it in writing. Oftentimes, you know, we'll see a response that says, oh, someone told us that we had approval, so we went ahead and bought it. Well, you want to get those approvals in writing. If you have a capital improvement or a capital expenditure, where maybe you're purchasing land or you're putting an addition onto a building and you're using federal funds to do that, you need prior approval. Even mortgage payments, even though it's a monthly cost and it might seem like less, I think there's been times where people might think, oh, it's like paying rent. Well, if you're going to use funds to pay rent, that's one thing, it's in your budget. But if you're using to make a mortgage payment, you need to get prior approval. Now with direct versus indirect costs, oftentimes you want to ensure if you have more than one funding source, you want to make sure that costs are allocated to the correct program. And also with indirect versus direct costs, some programs say we spoke earlier about there's certain earmarking requirements or you know, where there might be a cap on administrative costs. So it's important to note that sometimes there may be administrative costs that are in the indirect cost rate, but then there's also indirect costs included in the direct cost rate or even in a non-federal share component. So all of these costs would be included in that administrative cost calculation. So if there is a cap, all of that needs to be taken into consideration. And then now when you come down to, I've had recipients, you know, ask me, well, you know, sometimes, you know, I'll be talking to a CFO and they might be somewhat new and they're looking how they can learn to be in compliance. And I've had people ask me, well, do you have a manual or is there a book I can use to see what's allowable and what are the allowable expenses for me to spend the federal funds on? And actually for those grant awards that have the uniform guidance that are applicable to those programs, there is a section called the general provisions for select items of cost, and it very specifically breaks down individual items. And I provided just a few examples, but it will say this very specifically is allowed or under what circumstances it is or is not allowed. And chances are, if you have an item in mind, you're going to find it in that section of the uniform guidance. So that is what I say when people ask me, where is the manual for what's allowed? I direct them to that area. Next slide, please. Now, also within the allowable cost and cost principles, probably the most common finding is when we are lacking adequate documentation. The financial management systems must provide for an accurate and complete disclosure for the source and application of federal funds for all awards. So that basically means costs must be adequately documented. I often encourage grantees to designate sub-accounts within their accounting system to separately track program funds specifically. For folks that receive multiple funding sources from various programs and not even just ACF, you know, it's easy to put it all in the bank account and then pay the bills. But if you take your accounting software, you can actually track what funds you're receiving, what you're taking in from PMS, and then where those payments are applied. Because when the auditor comes in, they're going to want to see the drawdowns from payment management where you posted them to the general ledger. And then they're going to want to trace those costs to the canceled checks or the invoices or the vouchers. I think it's very common that we'll see question costs because they don't have the check or they don't have the invoice. So just to encourage that keeping track of the funds goes beyond just even making that entry into the general ledger. It's keeping that support documentation handy. And now with most of the accounting systems, we can scan it in and you can store an electronic version of that as well. Next slide, please. So cash management, this is becoming a pretty big audit finding these days. Now, grantees should really have written cash management procedures which minimize the time that funds are on hand. So you want to minimize the duration and the amount of cash on hand and the time elapsing from between when you draw that money down from payment management and you issue checks or other forms of payment. So given, now we have access, everything's electronic. You can draw down funds on a daily basis from payment management, and you can request those funds based on the immediate cash needs that you have and return any of those funds when excess cash needs are less than what was projected. So any drawdown that's in excess of those immediate cash needs could potentially be viewed as excess. And the recipient is responsible for determining when the federal funds have been deposited into the bank account for each drawdown, ensuring that the funds are fully dispersed as close as possible to when they're received. And if not, if there's cash on hand, returning that undispersed federal cash back to the payment management system. And of course, if you have questions about how you can return that funds, you can reach out to your liaison with the payment management system. Another important note about the cash management, HHS recently implemented a change to reporting requirements that it affects all ACF recipients, and many of you may have recently received an email notification about this change. So at the end of this week, payment management will no longer require the completion of that quarterly federal cash transaction report, the FCTR. This report, it's previously been used to collect recipient cash receipts and cash disbursement information and awards. And of course, that's where you would document the cash on hand. So this at the very end of this week is coming to the end. They're no longer going to require it. But the change that this implements is in the past, the disbursement balance in payment management was directly populated with the cash disbursements that or what you would report as expenditures. So you would have a difference and you'd have expenditures and you'd have cash on hand. Well, now going forward, that balance is going to be driven by the amount of drawdowns made by the recipient. So it's even more important to emphasize that your drawdown should reflect your immediate cash needs as accurately as possible and minimize any potential cash on hand for longer than needed to pay your immediate obligations. So if you haven't received that email, you can always reach out to your grant specialist, and the payment management system will also be posting a notice regarding that change on their website once it's implemented later this week. Next slide, please. Now, I also just wanted to touch base on period of performance because it's something that I've been seeing coming up more often. And I think there's a misconception, because here you have this money sitting in the account, you haven't drawn it down, and you have a need for it. There can be definite needs. So say if you draw down funds outside of the period of performance, even if that is used for otherwise allowable program expenses, it can result in a disallowance. And I think a lot of folks don't realize that. So I wanted to just emphasize that. We have some federal programs that have different obligation and liquidation periods, and it can be confusing and a lot to keep track of. For example, LIHEAP and childcare, they have very specific obligation periods. And some federal programs, they require funds to be liquidated with 90 days of the grant ending, while other programs, they might have indefinite liquidation periods. So it's really important to differentiate that. You need to determine, Back one. Determine whether the federal award was only charged for allowable costs incurred during the period of performance, and whether the financial obligations were liquidated within that required period of time. So I just wanted to emphasize that just because it does come up, and usually if we issue a disallowance letter, it'll go into appeal. And the first thing a grantee will say, well, I used it on things that were allowable, so shouldn't it be okay? And really that disallowance can stand. So as much as we want to help, it really needs to be charged for the proper period of performance. And I think with that, we're going to turn it over to Paul for the next poll question. So thank you, everyone.
Really nice job, Christania. Really good content there. All right, here's the second poll question. Get your fingers ready. Should be able to see it. Thank you. Got more than half, so it's a little bit longer here. Give it about another few seconds. Nobody liked our find a new auditor selection. We thought for sure that would be a heavily selected one, but all right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll if last chance. Okay. All right. Here are the results. So yeah, I think Wes will talk to this, but identify the root cause and take appropriate action was the first one selected or most selected. Follow the auditor's recommendations was number 2, and don't really care about audit findings, which is understandable for some people. So thank you for taking part.
All right, thank you, Paul. And I know you all, I know finding a new auditor, you may have wanted to select that, you just don't want to admit to it on here. If I were you, I'd probably consider the same thing, to be honest. Okay, so thanks everybody. I'm going to, we're a little bit behind, but I'm going to try to cover everything, just not touch too much on it. We do have time for questions at the end. We should have a few minutes. You can always reach out afterwards for questions to our contact information, I believe is on the website, if you have follow-up questions that we don't get to address today. So in the poll, we talked about addressing the root cause of the findings. One of the things that we are trying to do with our monitoring work is kind of help you guys with that, because ultimately the ultimate end result we would like to see is less audit findings coming across in your reports going to Christania and her team for resolution. It would be preferable for all parties, I believe, if overall the number of audit findings went down. So how do we kind of work towards that? One of the things that we're trying to do is build that into our monitoring reviews at the ACF level, recipient monitoring reviews. We want to help you avoid audit findings. That's not the sole reason, but we want to help you try to avoid audit findings if at all possible. So we built out a new monitoring review protocol. It started about 3 years ago. It is getting rolled out in phases. There are different phases to it. Really, the only one we are working on right now actively are policy reviews. Very key component is a building block of monitoring at the recipient level for these federal awards. The overall purpose, we want to provide quality service to ACF grantees in support of sound financial management practices by, number one, identifying impediments to successful financial management of ACF programs, as well as identifying opportunities for enhancements and improvements. We want to help provide direction and remediation efforts. So if we do find a problem, obviously we would like to work with you to help you find the best way to fix it. And then focus resources towards training and technical assistance. We want to use these monitoring reviews as a kind of a beacon, guide that from us to which organizations, which specific programs may need additional help. It's not clearly evident just from normal day-to-day interactions. So these reviews are really to help kind of focus on who needs help, and as best we can, try to give you that help. We do not want anybody to fail. We want everybody to be successful. So that is really one of the main core things behind these reviews. Benefits to recipients. Proactively identifying areas for financial improvement. Proactively, keyword there. Like I said at the beginning, we want to find things that root causes they may result later in findings before it ever gets to that point. If there is a policy issue that results down the road in you getting a disallowance issued, and it was due to you just not understanding compliance elements of certain areas in the CFR, that's, you know, that's we failed by getting that information and helping you understand that up front. So we're trying to proactively address that. Informing financial training and technical assistance efforts for grantees, just talked about that. We want to try to hone in. We have about 3,400-ish unique grantee organizations that we work with on a regular basis. We've got to find some way to whittle it down a little bit to, you know, not every single one of them needs help, and the ones that do need help, they don't all need the same level of help. We want to try to help or work internally to better identify who needs help and hopefully get you help you may need. And that can come in several different forms. Improving compliance with federal financial rules and regulations through policy maturation. These are at their core, these are monitoring reviews. There is a compliance element. So we are checking for certain things to make sure you are in compliance, core things, basic things to keep you in compliance. So back to the first poll question, the check the box exercise. It's not entirely not a check the box exercise because there are some things we do have to check for. But we are looking to help identify areas where you may need some assistance or where we already think there may be problems. And help to remedy those problems before they become actual issues. They result in monetary disallowances. That's not something that we want. Nobody really wants that. Policy review areas. So we cover 14 different areas in our policy reviews. Accounting for federal awards, compensation, cost principles, etc. These are what we've determined as our main review areas. So there are several different compliance elements that we are looking for in each of these review areas. They're centered around focusing on helping recipient organizations understand their main financial compliance requirements. And then also all individual review steps are based on areas of compliance within the Code of Federal Regulations. That's 45 CFR Part 75. And there are a few elements that are they are in the CFR, but they are referencing compliance things in the GAO Green Book, the standards for internal control in the federal government that recipient organizations are actually required to follow as well. So it may not be clearly abundant in the CFR what those are. We are checking for those things too. And those are mainly related to IT and one other entity controls. Tribal, well, let me back up for just one second. I just want to note that not everything we are checking in here for, like, oh, you're looking for policies in all these areas. Well, we do want to make clear to you, everything we're checking for, it is not required that you have a written policy in place to meet the compliance requirement. What we are looking for is, do you have a policy in place to help you understand your compliance requirements? So there are a couple areas where it is clearly laid out, such as in the compensation area. In the CFR, it is required for you to have a written policy that covers areas of compensation. So that is one where you have to have a written policy in place to be in compliance with the terms and conditions of your award. So we do differentiate in these reviews where we are looking to see that you have something that is clearly required, that you have this written policy. And then other areas, it's not necessarily that you're required to have it, but to help you better understand your awards and mitigate certain issues, it would be best to have a policy in that area. A big thing here is turnover. Turnover can be a really big problem if you do not have internally in your organization well-documented policies and procedures that if you have a brand new group of people in, if they don't have those policies in place, they're not going to understand how to execute the federal award. And that's what ultimately leads to audit findings. So having these things in place, understanding I need to do this when I'm registering as a federal award recipient, things like that. Like, this is what I need to do. This is when I need to do it. Those are the things we're trying to focus on, the areas where it could ultimately lead to findings down the road. So that's what we're really looking to get at here. Tribal monitoring discussion. So just going over a few things specifically for you guys, but also applicable to most other recipients. So policy reviews are conducted at the organizational level. So if we are doing a review of your tribe or your organization, we are not just looking at your awards for your entitlement programs or for, you know, whatever A&A programs you may have. We are looking at the breadth of your federal awards that are issued by ACF. We have some recipient organizations that have up to 15, 16, 17 different federal awards from ACF. So we are looking at these policy reviews. We are focused at the organizational level, not at the program specific level. No policies or things that we're looking for are program specific. These reviews are centered around assessing the entity's policies and procedures used to govern, guide how they administer ACF awards. Also, just to note, these reviews, we perform these 100% virtually, mainly due to COVID right now, but we will probably in the future, they will probably mostly remain virtual anyway, just because they are set up that way. It's easier on us, it's easier on the recipient. We don't have to show up at your door and you have to make sure that you have, you know, these 3 days or this week blocked off to deal with us. So it makes things a lot more flexible. Tribal specific information. In our current cohort of reviewees that we're kind of, I want to say right in the middle of the review cycle right now, about 20% of our current reviewees are tribal organizations. So just to give you an idea of you know, where you fall in the total bucket of reviewees. And then Office of Grants Management, we hope to utilize the results of these reviews to help identify common areas of concern across tribal recipient organizations, which should help direct future training and technical assistance efforts. I'm hoping at this conference next year, we can come to you all and say, we looked at the totality of the results across these organizations, these tribal organizations that were included in this year's reviews. And these are some of the common themes we saw across these organizations, and look for trends that we can use to help focus, okay, where do you most need help? Do you need help in the area of compensation or in procurement, whatever it is? We want to try to focus on what are the things that we should really be focusing on to help you be successful. And with that, I think we are done, and I believe we have about 5 minutes left for questions.
Yeah, we've got a couple out here, Wes. It looks like the two are pretty much the same. We used to get a template copy of an updated fiscal policy and procedures at our grantee training. Is there a template like that available now? And I think the second one that Marita is asking is pretty much the same thing. Where can I find the sample template for needed policies?
Yes, I would assume that was something that originated with A&A, maybe what you were referring to. One thing that we are looking to get out of these reviews are we are absolutely looking for examples of superstars here, where we have an organization that has very well developed, comprehensive, mature policy documents, and we are actively looking to find organizations that have those. Ask them, would you be willing to help us work with other recipients and get them to understand what an ideal policy in this area, whether it be compensation or something else, might look like. We really want to leverage these results to help as many people as possible. So to your specific question though, I think I would have to defer to A&A so we can get back to you about an answer on that, Marita. But I know we had an audit question up here from Nicole Cristania about how does, if I understand correctly, the 4E programs that don't follow the cost principles, kind of what's the differentiation there with the single audits?
Okay, hi, yeah. So that's actually the wonderful thing about the compliance supplement is that if you're not sure what section of the uniform guidance applies, there is actually a section in the uniform guidance and its applicability, like many of the block grant programs or the LIHEAP grants, those cost principal areas don't apply to those grants. But so if you can either reference that section of the uniform guidance, which states which programs are applicable to which sections of the uniform guidance, I believe it's subpart C that is not applicable to the Title 4E, but Title 4E still definitely requires a single audit if the grantee is over that threshold. And if you're wondering which components apply to your program, the compliance supplement does specify what parts of 45 CFR 75 apply. So that again is exactly why the compliance supplement is a very handy document to have. And I think too, you want to note that it's not just about the cost principles, there's very specific program requirements. So that's something to emphasize too. Here, we're just generally talking about money and dollars and accounting and cost, but then there's the very specific program requirements to follow as well. But I would reference you to again, the uniform guidance section on applicability and then the compliance supplement itself to check on which parts apply.
We have one question up here. I think might have got caught in the weeds. So what's an example of what we would be looking for as far as an IT policy? So there is a grantee compliance quick sheet. Paul, I don't know if we loaded that already, but we'll load that in the materials for this workshop. So there is a compliance quick sheet that kind of gives you a rundown of the compliance areas that we're specifically covering in our policy reviews, and it will link to the actual regulation that covers each of those areas, including the IT area. So Sid, if you wanted to check that out, that quick sheet will help you. We'll make sure that gets loaded. That quick sheet will help you hone in on, okay, if I get one of these reviews in the future, this is what they'll be looking for IT. And it kind of helps you, by looking for that, it helps you understand what your compliance regulations actually are. So.
I will post that to chat here in a second as soon as I locate it, the quick sheet.
And that will be updated. We do that before each review cycle. So after this review cycle, that will be updated. We are in the midst of, we are still following 45 CFR Part 75. Eventually, there will be some adoption of 2 CFR 200, whether that is us fully adopting that or updating 45 CFR Part 75. That is going to happen in the future. We don't know when. 2 CFR 200 was updated a couple of years ago, just for everybody's information. So we have not updated 45 CFR, we being HHS, to update based on those 2 CFR 200 updates. So it may be ours is updated, or it may be we just start following 2 CFR 200. But keep an eye out. We will make sure that it's communicated clearly to all recipients when those changes are enacted. So, but you all make sure you always follow what is in the terms and conditions of your award until clearly advised, or not advised, but directed otherwise by updated terms and conditions. So.
Okay, is that it on the questions?
Yeah, I'm having some difficulty posting it to the chat. I will continue to work on it. It is also loaded for tomorrow's workshop, OGM open discussion. It's listed there as well, the quick sheet. So if I can't get it in, you can't see it there, please join us tomorrow. You'll be able to see it then. Go ahead, Patty.
Okay, all right. Thank you all for attending the day 2 of the 2022 ACF Indigenous Program Conference. We hope this was both informative and inspiring. Before we depart today, though, I wanted to highlight just 2 items. Please continue to visit the 2022 ACF IPC website to explore the virtual exhibitor hall to view ACF grant recipient projects throughout the US and the Pacific Island. You can find the link in the chat. Paul put it out there. Also visit the ACF resources page to access more detailed information on ACF program offices and partners. This concludes our session. Thank you everyone for joining. Please continue to participate in the other sessions and have a wonderful day. Thanks.